Madrid in the autumn of 1907 carried a chill that seemed to settle deep in the bones. Narrow cobblestone streets, slick with rain from an earlier drizzle, glistened under the dim glow of gas lamps. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke from wood-burning stoves, mingling with the faint aroma of fresh bread from the panaderias that dotted the neighborhood. In one modest townhouse on Calle de San Bernardo, the usually quiet household of the Del Valle family was in a state of restless unease. It was not the first autumn without their daughter, Isabella, but it felt as though the weight of her absence had thickened over the weeks, settling like a stubborn fog. The family's grief was raw yet private, held in the small gestures of ritual and remembrance, a flower placed carefully on the windowsill, a prayer whispered before meals, the soft hum of lullabies that no longer had a living audience. The first letter arrived on an otherwise ordinary morning. Manuel, the father, had been sorting through correspondence at the small writing desk near the parlor window. His fingers paused as he picked up a thin, yellowed envelope that did not resemble the usual municipal notices or bills. The handwriting was elegant yet unfamiliar, each stroke deliberate, almost unnatural, and the paper carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay. A chill ran down his spine as he read the first line, "Do not forget her, for she is not at rest." Manuel's hand trembled slightly, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck bristle. He looked around the parlor, half expecting the room to answer him, but it remained silent, the heavy velvet curtains swaying slightly from a draught in the hallway. Isabel, the mother, entered quietly, drawn by the abrupt movement of her husband. She noticed the envelope immediately, her eyes narrowing as though some instinct told her not to open it. "What is it?" she asked, voice low and tense, as if speaking too loudly might awaken some hidden threat. Manuel's reply faltered. "A letter, for Isabella." Even speaking her name aloud made the house feel heavier, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves mourned alongside them. He handed the envelope to her with trembling hands. Isabel's fingers lingered over the paper, hesitating, the cold touch of the letter seeping into her skin. She unfolded it slowly, reading the words aloud with a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The contents were brief but suffused with a weight that no mere sentence could carry. She watches. She remembers. She warns. The punctuation felt deliberate, almost accusatory, and an odd sense of familiarity clung to the handwriting. Isabel's eyes widened as the letters seemed to pulse before her gaze, the words striking a chord of recognition that made her heart pound. The family sat in silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room the only sound that punctuated the growing tension. Outside, the city carried on as usual, but inside the Del Valle home, the air was thick with a dread that felt alive, pressing against their chests with invisible hands. Manuel tried to rationalize the moment. Perhaps someone who knew her, sent this. A friend, a relative. His voice, though firm, betrayed the unease creeping into his own thoughts. Isabel shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together as if trying to hold back a flood of fear. "No one writes like this," she murmured. "No one could know the things it mentions." The letters, she realized, referred to incidents that had only occurred within the private confines of their home, moments of whispered conversation, gestures of mourning, memories shared only in hushed tones. The knowledge contained in the envelope was impossible, yet undeniably present. That night, the family struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The dining room was lit with flickering candles, shadows dancing across the walls, creating shapes that seemed almost animate in the low light. Manuel attempted to read aloud from a local newspaper, hoping to drown out the oppressive silence with the banal rhythm of printed words. But each sentence felt hollow, meaningless in the presence of the unnerving letter that sat on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel. The children of the household, though young and uncomprehending, sensed the tension and clung quietly to their mother, their small hands gripping her skirts as she moved through the room. Sleep came in fits and starts, shallow and disturbed. Isabel dreamed of Isabella walking the halls of the house, her small figure outlined in shadows, her gaze both pleading and accusatory. Manuel's dreams were darker, filled with whispers he could not understand and glimpses of the girl that left his waking mind restless. When morning came, the letters had multiplied. Another envelope lay on the windowsill, matching the first in its curious paper, familiar scent, and cryptic tone. The handwriting was identical, the words even more pointed: "Time grows short. Listen carefully, for the warning is not idle." Fear, subtle yet insistent, began to shape their daily existence. Each knock at the door, each creak in the floorboards, became a potential messenger of something otherworldly. The family tried to confide in neighbors, but reactions ranged from polite dismissal to quiet unease. Rumors began to spread in hushed voices across the neighborhood. Some claimed the girl had returned, others whispered that the house itself had been cursed. No one could explain the letters, their provenance, or their intent. The Del Valles were left suspended between disbelief and dread, caught in the impossible space where grief met the supernatural. The cold arrival of the letters marked more than just the beginning of a series of disturbing events, it reshaped the family's reality. Each day became a careful navigation of fear, memory, and expectation. Every letter carried the dual weight of familiarity and menace, the sense that Isabella's presence lingered beyond the grave, observing and warning in ways they could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The city of Madrid, bustling and indifferent, continued to exist outside their private terror, unaware of the intimate, creeping horror unfolding on a quiet street in 1907. By the week's end, the family had learned one grim truth: the letters were not random, nor were they mere tricks of fate. They were deliberate, patient, and unerringly accurate in their knowledge of the family's daily life. Manuel and Isabel began keeping a small ledger, recording the arrival times, wording, and peculiar details of each correspondence. Each entry was a testament to an order of events that defied reason, a meticulous record of something deeply unnatural. The house itself seemed to respond, each shadow lengthening as if in acknowledgement of their fear, the wind outside whispering against the shutters like a distant, mournful voice. By the close of the first week, the Del Valles were caught in a rhythm dictated by the letters. Anticipation, dread, and grief interwove seamlessly into their lives. Even the mundane, meals, errands, conversations, was tainted by the knowledge that at any moment, another envelope might arrive, carrying with it another fragment of an impossible warning. And through it all, the streets of Madrid remained indifferent, oblivious to the quiet horror taking root in the house at Calle de San Bernardo, where grief had become a living, persistent presence and the dead, it seemed, were reaching out with urgent intent. Madrid in the early autumn of 1907 was a city caught between eras, its streets a curious blend of modernization and lingering superstition. Streetcars rattled over worn cobblestones, carrying merchants, laborers, and students through narrow avenues lined with ornate facades and shuttered windows. Gas lamps flickered against the gathering dusk, their soft glow painting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. The city's heartbeat was irregular, a mixture of routine commerce and whispered secrets, of bustling plazas and alleyways that seemed untouched by time. The scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with smoke from coal stoves, creating an atmosphere both inviting and slightly oppressive. In this environment, ordinary life persisted, yet beneath the surface, Madrid carried an undercurrent of unease, a sensitivity to the inexplicable, the uncanny, and the tragic. In the quiet neighborhood of Chimberry, the Del Valle family resided in a modest townhouse with a small garden in the rear. Manuel Del Valle, a civil clerk by trade, had inherited the property from his father, along with a reputation for diligence and respectability. His wife, Isabel, came from a family of minor merchants, known for their quiet piety and dedication to household order. Their daughter Isabella, now deceased, had been a spirited child with an unusual sensitivity to the moods of others, often described as unusually perceptive for her age. Her death, sudden and without clear explanation, had left the family fractured in ways that words could scarcely capture. The townhouse, once a place of routine domestic warmth, now felt heavy with absence, each room echoing the small tragedies that had quietly reshaped the family's existence. Neighbors in the street carried their own lives, but whispers of the Del Valle tragedy circulated quickly, shaped as much by imagination as by fact. Some suggested that Isabella had been cursed, others that her passing was an omen of misfortune for the household. Madrid, like many cities of its time, maintained a delicate tension between faith and reason. Clergy would preach morality from pulpit and pulpit, yet scholars and professionals championed rationality and scientific progress. This duality infused everyday life. A passerby might cross himself at the sight of a beggar, yet debate the latest postal reforms with equal seriousness. It was within this delicate balance that the Del Valle family found themselves, forced to navigate the ordinary and the extraordinary simultaneously, the city's duality amplifying their private anxiety. The townhouse itself reflected the family's standing and taste. Dark mahogany furniture lined the main parlor, embroidered draperies softened the light, and small oil paintings of landscapes and ancestors adorned the walls. Each object carried memories of happier times, yet now seemed to serve as a reminder of absence. The garden, though modest, had once been Isabella's refuge, a place where she chased butterflies and nurtured small blooms with a careful hand. Manuel and Isabel often found themselves lingering near the garden window, tracing patterns in the soil or gazing at the trellises, imagining the life that had been stolen from them. The house had become a vessel for grief, holding not just memories but the accumulating weight of the inexplicable letters that continued to arrive without fail. In the streets beyond the Del Valle home, life moved in rhythms that contrasted sharply with the family's growing unease. Market vendors shouted their wares, the clatter of wooden carts echoed in narrow streets, and children played tag in small courtyards, their laughter piercing the fog of melancholy that surrounded the Del Valle household. Yet even as the city carried on, Madrid was a place acutely aware of the supernatural. Folktales persisted in whispered conversations, often in the context of cautionary advice, spirits that returned to correct unfinished deeds, messages from the departed, or omens that foretold misfortune. Such stories were rarely spoken of openly, yet they shaped perceptions, creating a fertile ground for fear and speculation when unusual events occurred. It was in this context that the letters from the dead gained both potency and plausibility, threading themselves into a culture already primed to listen for whispers beyond the veil. The Del Valle family's social circle further highlighted the intersection of ordinary and extraordinary. Manuel's colleagues at the municipal offices were pragmatic and precise, discussing bureaucratic matters with meticulous detail. They dismissed talk of supernatural letters as fanciful or attention-seeking, yet they could not fully conceal a trace of unease when Manuel mentioned the letters in passing. Isabel, meanwhile, confided cautiously to her friends in the local sewing circle, who expressed a mix of skepticism and empathy. Some suggested that the letters were the work of a mischievous prankster, while others hinted that Isabella's spirit might truly be attempting communication. Each reaction reinforced the family's sense of isolation. In Madrid's crowded streets, their experiences were both unique and incomprehensible, a private horror unfolding amidst the indifference and curiosity of the living. Religion, as ever, played a subtle but pervasive role. Chapels dotted the neighborhood, and the tolling of bells marked not just hours but reminders of mortality and divine order. Priests occasionally visited the household, offering prayers and counsel, yet even they were cautious, constrained by doctrine and the limits of reason. The tension between faith and skepticism mirrored the family's own struggle. They longed for comfort in divine explanation but found themselves confronted with evidence that defied conventional understanding. Each letter arriving from the unknown seemed to challenge both their rationality and their piety, creating an emotional and intellectual conflict that left them frayed and uncertain. The city's architecture itself seemed to mirror the duality of Madrid. Ornate cathedrals cast long shadows across narrow streets, while the facades of commercial buildings reflected sunlight in sharp, dazzling angles. Alleys led to hidden courtyards, offering glimpses of lives lived quietly and mysteriously. In these spaces, the ordinary and the strange coexisted naturally. A passerby might encounter a child playing with a wooden toy, only to feel a fleeting sense of being observed, a sensation dismissed immediately as the imagination's trick. The Del Valle household existed within this environment, where the ordinary cityscape could be read in multiple ways, as a familiar home or a labyrinth of unseen forces waiting to intrude. The family's grief intertwined seamlessly with this citywide tension. Each morning, Manuel walked through streets alive with the noise of commerce and chatter, yet his mind remained tethered to the house, to the letters, and to the impossible knowledge they carried. Isabel, managing the household's daily routines, moved through her domestic tasks with a quiet, almost ritualistic precision, as if the act of maintaining order could stave off the encroaching fear. Even the smallest gestures, a carefully folded cloth, a polished tabletop, a flower arranged in a vase, became acts of resistance against the intangible dread that had begun to occupy their home. By the end of the first week, Madrid's shadows had settled inextricably over the Del Valle family. The city's rhythms continued outside their doors, indifferent yet strangely complicit, as if it observed their struggle without intervening. The letters, the whispers, the memory of Isabella, all converged in the townhouse, creating a microcosm of fear and uncertainty against a backdrop of a city alive with both rationality and superstition. Madrid in 1907, with its foggy streets, flickering lamps, and quiet, watchful citizens, had become more than a setting. It was an active participant in the unfolding mystery, shaping perception, amplifying dread, and setting the stage for events that would test the limits of reason, belief, and human endurance. The days following the arrival of the first letters were marked by a peculiar and unsettling shift in the Del Valle household. Initially, Manuel and Isabel tried to maintain normal routines, but subtle anomalies began to unsettle their sense of reality. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, soft and deliberate, as though someone walked just behind them when no one was there. Doors that had been firmly closed were occasionally found slightly ajar, though the family was certain they had been locked. The letters, arriving at irregular intervals, seemed to anticipate the family's actions, each envelope containing phrasing that was both intimate and impossible, referencing private conversations and minor domestic mishaps with unnerving precision. Neighbors began to notice a change in the Del Valles as well. Isabel's usually composed demeanor now carried a tension that did not go unnoticed. She walked the streets with an air of distraction, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to encounter an invisible observer. Manuel, once methodical and precise in his civil duties, grew irritable and distracted, frequently pausing mid-conversation or losing track of important paperwork. Whispers began circulating among the neighbors. Some suggested that the family was cursed, others speculated that madness was creeping in, and a few feared that the dead daughter's spirit had somehow returned to linger over the household. In a city such as Madrid, where superstition and skepticism coexisted uneasily, these rumors carried a weight that made the family both objects of curiosity and of quiet avoidance. The letters themselves evolved during this period. The messages grew longer, more detailed, and increasingly insistent, urging attention to actions that seemed mundane to outsiders but held significance within the household. One letter referenced a broken teacup from a week prior, another described a conversation that had taken place entirely in whispered tones. The handwriting remained identical, impossibly consistent, yet the ink sometimes appeared fresher than the paper should allow, as if the correspondence existed outside conventional temporality. Each delivery amplified the family's sense of being observed and manipulated, creating a constant, low-level dread that infiltrated every aspect of daily life. At night, the household's unease intensified. Shadows cast by candlelight seemed to move independently, stretching across walls and floors in unnatural ways. The soft rustling of curtains or the occasional creak of floorboards became signs of a presence just beyond perception. Isabel began waking in the early hours, convinced she heard her daughter calling from the parlor or garden. Manuel, too, found sleep elusive, plagued by the sensation of someone watching from the corners of his vision. Even when both parents remained awake and alert, the sensation persisted, a reminder that the ordinary parameters of time, space, and causality no longer offered comfort or clarity. Children in the neighborhood, though unaware of the full circumstances, reacted instinctively to the family's tension. Small groups avoided playing near the Del Valle home, and those who ventured close sometimes reported seeing fleeting shapes in the windows or hearing indistinct whispers when the street was otherwise silent. These observations, dismissed by adults as imagination or coincidence, nevertheless contributed to the growing aura of unease surrounding the household. Madrid's residents, trained to observe subtle social cues, understood that the Del Valle's private turmoil was now a public spectacle, even if the true cause remained hidden. As the family struggled with the creeping anomalies, Manuel began keeping a meticulous record of each letter's arrival, the precise wording, and any accompanying phenomena. Isabel, though initially skeptical of such systematic documentation, joined him in the effort, noting minor changes in the household environment, such as unexplained drafts or objects slightly displaced. Their diligence, intended as a form of control over the uncontrollable, became a double-edged sword. While it provided a sense of order, it also reinforced the constant presence of the inexplicable, ensuring that the household's attention was perpetually drawn back to the letters and the whispers that accompanied them. The psychological toll became increasingly evident. Isabel developed episodes of intense anxiety, her hands trembling as she carried out simple household tasks. Manuel experienced bouts of rage and despair, often finding himself pacing the narrow rooms of the townhouse, muttering to no one, and struggling to maintain the facade of normalcy in public. Their conversations, once measured and comforting, now contained pauses filled with fear, and the words, Isabella, or the letters, became loaded with unspeakable tension. Friends and relatives visiting the household often left uneasy, unable to reconcile the outward appearance of routine with the subtle, pervasive signs of mental strain and haunting. By the third week, the presence of the anomalous letters had begun to influence even the most ordinary aspects of life. Meals were eaten in near silence, the family hesitant to speak lest their words be recorded or manipulated. Manual labor, chores, and errands were undertaken with heightened vigilance, each movement carefully considered as though some unseen observer might be monitoring for mistakes. Even interactions with neighbors were cautious, the Del Valles weighing every phrase, every gesture, fearful that the knowledge contained in the letters might extend beyond their home to the wider world. During this period, subtle auditory phenomena emerged. Isabel occasionally reported hearing soft, indistinct murmurs near the parlor window, a voice that seemed both familiar and otherworldly. Manuel noted that when he approached certain rooms, he would catch fragments of what sounded like laughter or crying, though no one was present. The children, though young, were sensitive to these cues, often refusing to enter specific parts of the house alone. The family's once safe home had become a landscape of uncertainty, a place where perception and reality intersected in ways that defied rational explanation. Attempts to seek external validation of the letter's authenticity only deepened the mystery. A trusted neighbor attempted to open an envelope in his presence, noting nothing unusual except the handwriting, which he acknowledged as peculiar but ultimately dismissible. Yet when he left the house, the envelope returned mysteriously to the Del Valle parlor, untouched and precisely where it had been found previously. Such events eroded confidence in conventional understanding, leaving the family reliant only on their observations and intuition, and intensifying the sense that the anomaly could not be circumvented or controlled. The culmination of these first whispers was an emotional crescendo, moment when the household fully recognized the impossibility of the situation. One evening, as rain streaked the windows and the wind whispered through the shutters, another letter arrived, more insistent than any before, "She watches even when you think she sleeps. Ignore not the warning." Isabel read aloud, her voice barely rising above a whisper, as Manuel and the children sat frozen in silent acknowledgement. The shadows seemed to lean closer, the flicker of candlelight casting shapes that resembled the child they mourned. In that instant, the family understood that the letters were not mere communication, they were a presence, a force that had infiltrated their reality and would not relent. By the end of the month, the Del Valles existed in a fragile equilibrium. Daily life persisted, but every act, every decision, was colored by the knowledge of observation, by the whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The letters had moved beyond being simple anomalies, they had become a lens through which every event, every interaction, was filtered. Madrid continued to bustle beyond their doors, indifferent to the unfolding tension within the townhouse. Yet within that home, grief and fear had converged with the impossible, creating a reality where the ordinary had been replaced by constant, unrelenting suspense, and where the first whispers of the dead had irrevocably altered the fabric of the Del Valle family's existence. The initial shock of the letter's arrival gave way to a creeping, insidious dread as they began to arrive more frequently. What had started as a single, bewildering envelope soon became a pattern impossible to ignore. Each morning, the family awoke to find a new piece of correspondence lying on the windowsill, atop the mantel, or sometimes tucked between the pages of a book. The handwriting remained the same, precise, flowing, impossibly familiar, and each message seemed more urgent than the last. Warnings now carried specific instructions, references to recent events, and even predictions that skirted the line between the probable and the impossible. Manuel attempted to rationalize the influx. Perhaps there was a prankster, he reasoned, someone intimately familiar with the household's routines. But as he read each letter, any explanation rooted in ordinary logic faltered. One note described a vase that had been knocked over the previous night, another recounted a conversation held in hushed tones between Isabel and a neighbor. The knowledge contained within the letters could only have been observed firsthand, yet there was no trace of intrusion. The family's anxiety intensified as they realized that these messages were not just cryptic warnings, they were deeply informed, unnervingly precise, and unrelentingly persistent. As the letters multiplied, the Del Valle household began to change. The parlor, once a space of quiet domesticity, became a place of constant vigilance. Chairs were arranged to allow clear sight lines to every corner, windows were checked repeatedly, and doors were locked multiple times throughout the day. Isabel moved through the rooms with a new caution, her eyes darting toward shadows, her hands trembling as she reached for objects that might conceal another message. Manuel, whose mind had been grounded in order and routine, began obsessively cataloging each letter, noting not only the date and time of arrival but also peculiar details, the type of ink, the subtle scent of the paper, and the minor yet undeniable shifts in phrasing that suggested intent and awareness. Neighbors noticed these changes as well. Whispers in the streets and alleyways of Chimberry began to circulate, describing the Del Valles as haunted, touched by something both terrifying and inexplicable. Children avoided playing near the townhouse, sensing the tension that seemed to radiate from within its walls. Merchants and passers-by spoke in hushed tones, some suggesting that the letters were evidence of a family curse, others that the child's spirit lingered in the home. Yet despite these rumors, few dared to offer assistance, for Madrid had always been a city of caution when it came to matters of the unseen. Curiosity existed alongside fear, but direct intervention was rare, leaving the family increasingly isolated. The content of the letters grew progressively more detailed and unsettling. They began to reference minor accidents, small losses, and private conversations that occurred entirely within the home. One note warned of a candle that would fall if left unattended, and later that evening, a flame toppled onto the rug, narrowly avoiding disaster. Another described the exact words of a quiet argument between Isabel and Manuel over household chores, words that had been spoken in near whispers. Each instance eroded the family's sense of security, reinforcing the notion that these letters were not merely symbolic but possessed an uncanny ability to bridge the distance between knowledge and action. The letters' tone also shifted subtly. Initially formal, almost distant, they gradually became more intimate and accusatory, as if the writer were observing not just actions but emotions. Expressions of grief, guilt, and fear were mirrored back to the family with unsettling accuracy, forcing them to confront feelings they had attempted to suppress. The psychological impact was profound. Isabel began experiencing vivid moments of déjà vu, sensing that events were unfolding precisely as predicted, while Manuel's sleep became fractured by dreams in which the letters appeared, always inked and folded with the same meticulous precision. Attempts to seek rational explanations were largely futile. Postal officials were consulted, but none could account for the apparent impossibility of the letters' journeys. Clergy were summoned to offer prayers or spiritual counsel, yet even they expressed hesitation, suggesting that some forces might lie beyond their understanding. Local scholars and acquaintances with expertise in handwriting analysis offered only partial insight, noting consistency and precision but providing no answers to the deeper mystery of the letter's origins. Each failed explanation added weight to the household's anxiety, reinforcing a sense of helplessness and the creeping suspicion that the phenomenon would continue without reprieve. The letters began to affect daily routines. Meals were eaten in tense silence, as each member of the family considered the possibility that any movement might provoke further messages. Conversations were carefully measured, and even the smallest gestures, placing a cup on a table, closing a window, were conducted with heightened awareness. The household became a microcosm of fear and anticipation, its members locked in a rhythm dictated by the letters themselves. Social interactions beyond the home were increasingly limited, as the family feared that outsiders might inadvertently become involved in the unfolding mystery. Psychologically, the letters became a force that reshaped the household entirely. Anxiety and hypervigilance dominated thoughts, leaving little space for ordinary domestic concerns. Isabel began to display signs of obsessive behavior, checking and rechecking surfaces for hidden envelopes, while Manuel recorded observations with the meticulous care of a chronicler confronting the inexplicable. The children, sensing the household's tension, became withdrawn and hesitant, further amplifying the family's sense of isolation. Madrid outside remained unchanged, bustling and indifferent, but within the walls of the townhouse, a silent, pervasive terror had taken hold. By the time the letter's arrival became a daily certainty, the Del Valle family had entered a state of fragile coexistence with the phenomenon. Each envelope was both a warning and a presence, a reminder that the boundary between life and death, between the known and the unknowable, had been breached. The letters multiplied not merely in number but in psychological weight, transforming mundane reality into a landscape of uncertainty, suspicion, and fear. The household existed in a perpetual state of anticipation, haunted by the knowledge that with each morning came the inevitable appearance of another letter, another whisper from the past, and another fragment of the impossible made tangible. In this way, the multiplication of the letters became not just a sequence of events but a force that reshaped perception, behavior, and emotional stability. The Del Valle family, once ordinary and respected within their community, now navigated a world in which the ordinary had been replaced by constant vigilance, where every action could provoke consequence, and where the boundary between grief and terror, between memory and manipulation, had all but vanished. Madrid outside remained indifferent, yet within the townhouse, reality had shifted irrevocably, the letters multiplying not only in number but in the power to dominate thought, perception, and the fragile equilibrium of daily life. By the time the letters had multiplied into an unrelenting tide, the Del Valle household began to experience phenomena that no longer fit within the confines of written warnings. The ordinary sounds of a home, footsteps on creaking floorboards, the soft sigh of wind through a partially open window, took on a menacing quality, as though the house itself had become a stage for unseen actors. Isabel first noticed the whispers one evening while preparing tea in the dimly lit kitchen. The words were indistinct, carried on a voice that seemed simultaneously near and impossibly far, barely audible yet impossible to ignore. At first, she assumed it to be fatigue or the trick of imagination, but the whispers persisted, growing clearer in tone yet remaining unintelligible in content. Manuel began noticing oddities of his own. Objects that had been left in plain view, books, utensils, or folded linens, appeared slightly moved, as though brushed by invisible hands. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors, not in the measured rhythm of ordinary habitation but with the irregular cadence of someone pacing in anxious anticipation. Shadows lengthened and shortened in ways that defied the movement of gaslight flames, occasionally forming shapes that suggested a small figure standing at the edge of vision, only to vanish when looked at directly. The couple's sleep became fitful, plagued by dreams in which the letters themselves spoke, their inked words shifting into whispered voices that recited warnings and intimate truths. The children, perceptive despite their youth, became acutely sensitive to the atmosphere in the home. One evening, the younger child, Lucia, refused to enter the parlor, her small voice trembling as she insisted that Isabella is there, watching. The parents attempted to soothe her, but the conviction in the child's tone was unnerving. It suggested more than imagination, it suggested recognition, a sense of presence that had extended beyond absence. These experiences were subtle yet cumulative, layering fear upon fear, creating an almost tangible sense that the household had been invaded by something that could not be observed directly yet exerted influence in every corner. Neighbors began to speak of strange occurrences as well. Some reported seeing flickering lights in the Del Valle windows late at night, others claimed to hear faint murmurs when passing the townhouse. While the public dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or imagination, the pattern of observation added to the growing aura of unease. Madrid, a city accustomed to blending superstition and rationality, allowed these rumors to circulate quietly, whispered among residents who were unwilling to confront them directly but unwilling to forget them entirely. Within the household, however, the effect was immediate and profound. The family's isolation deepened, and trust in ordinary experience eroded. As these auditory and visual anomalies intensified, the family's psychological state became increasingly fragile. Isabel often spent long periods standing by windows, listening intently for sounds that might be the whispered voice of her deceased daughter. Manuel attempted to engage with rational explanation, walking the rooms, tapping walls, and examining the letters for hidden mechanisms, yet each effort ended in frustration. The letters' content seemed eerily attuned to the family's perceptions, referencing incidents or minor domestic disturbances that had occurred in their absence. Even the act of investigating became part of the phenomenon, as though the letters and whispers responded to attention, shaping themselves around the household's attempts to maintain control. One evening, the auditory phenomena took a particularly vivid turn. As Isabel sat by the fire, reading one of the letters aloud to Manuel, a soft, high-pitched giggle echoed from the corner of the parlor. The sound was unmistakable, playful, familiar, and unbearably intimate. Isabel froze, the letter trembling in her hands, as a chill swept through the room. Manuel's gaze followed hers to the far corner, but the space was empty. Yet the sound had been real, and its familiarity, an unmistakable echo of Isabella's presence, pierced the fragile boundary between memory and current reality. The family sat in silence, each aware that the home was no longer merely inhabited by themselves but by an unseen consciousness whose motives and nature were unknowable. The letters themselves seemed to act as catalysts for these experiences. On nights when a new envelope arrived, the voices became more pronounced, more insistent. Murmurs moved from the background to the foreground of perception, often seeming to comment on the very act of reading the letters. Words like listen, heed, and watch were detected, though never fully coherent, as if the presence was testing attention, assessing compliance, or simply establishing dominance over the household's awareness. Sleep-deprived and psychologically strained, Manuel and Isabel began to feel that the house had become a living entity, one that responded to their fear and vigilance with increasing intensity. Neighbors' observations occasionally intersected with the household's experiences. A local baker reported seeing a small, shadowy figure moving in the parlor at dusk, though he was unable to provide detail beyond its fleeting motion. Another resident passing late one night heard indistinct whispers emanating from the garden, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. These external observations, though rare, added an additional layer of credibility to the family's experiences, suggesting that the phenomena were not entirely subjective but had manifestations detectable, however briefly, by others. The psychological impact on the family was profound. The ordinary rituals of daily life, eating, cleaning, conversing, were overshadowed by constant vigilance. Manuel's attention to paperwork became compulsive, Isabel's movements through the house were measured and deliberate. The children, absorbing the anxiety and tension, grew quiet, withdrawn, and cautious. The home itself, once a safe refuge, had transformed into a landscape of unseen forces, where sound and shadow could no longer be trusted and where every perception was subject to question. By the end of this period, the household had adapted to a new, fragile reality. They lived in a state of heightened awareness, balancing routine and ritual against the unpredictability of the letters and the accompanying voices. Sleep, once restorative, had become another domain of uncertainty, the line between waking and dreaming blurred, and the presence of Isabella, though unseen, felt palpably near. Madrid outside continued with its bustling streets, indifferent to the suffering and fear contained within the townhouse walls. Yet for the Del Valle family, the ordinary world had been replaced by one in which the dead whispered, shadows moved with intent, and the impossibility of their situation became an unrelenting, inescapable truth. As the letters continued their relentless arrival, the Del Valle family found themselves increasingly turning to faith for solace and explanation. Initially, their religious practice had been quiet and routine, whispered prayers before meals, attendance at Sunday Mass, small rituals observed in the privacy of their home. But the inexplicable nature of the letters, combined with the auditory and visual phenomena, strained ordinary devotion to its limits. Isabel, in particular, felt the weight of guilt and uncertainty pressing on her conscience, as though the child's death and the subsequent warnings carried some hidden moral significance that required divine interpretation. A local priest, Father Aguilar, was summoned to the house one afternoon. The streets of Madrid were overcast, and the sound of rain tapping on the tiles seemed to echo the family's tension. Father Aguilar, a man of measured temperament and considerable reputation for spiritual insight, entered with the intent to provide guidance. He listened patiently as Manuel and Isabel recounted the letters, the whispers, and the strange occurrences that had unsettled their household. The priest nodded solemnly, acknowledging their fear without judgment, yet his eyes betrayed a hint of skepticism. Faith, he explained, could illuminate the unseen, but it could not always provide immediate understanding of inexplicable events. Isabel sought reassurance through ritual. She spent hours kneeling before the family's modest altar, reciting prayers that had once brought comfort but now felt fragile and insufficient. Candles were lit in deliberate sequences, holy water sprinkled over doorways and windows, and small tokens of protection, crucifixes, medals, and charms, were placed strategically throughout the house. Each act was a mixture of hope and desperation, an attempt to reclaim a sense of order and to shield the household from forces that seemed to defy explanation. The presence of the letters, however, remained unaffected. No ritual could prevent their arrival, no prayer could alter the timing or content, leaving the family in a constant state of tension between faith and helplessness. Father Aguilar suggested the possibility that the letters were a form of divine warning, a test of the family's moral and spiritual fortitude. The priest encouraged them to interpret each message with care, to consider its implications and to respond through devotion and good deeds. Yet even as he spoke, the priest's own uncertainty was apparent. The specificity of the letters, their timing, and the intimate knowledge they contained fell outside any framework of conventional understanding. He recommended repeated prayers, blessings of the home, and a heightened awareness of spiritual practices, but admitted that the origin and purpose of the messages might remain beyond comprehension. As religious efforts intensified, the psychological strain on the family deepened. Isabel often sat in the chapel corner of their parlor, fingers interlaced, repeating prayers for hours, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. Manuel, though less overtly devotional, began accompanying her, reading scripture aloud in the hope that divine words might counteract the growing influence of the letters. The children, witnessing the adults' fervent activity, became both cautious and withdrawn, uncertain whether the rituals were protective or merely a response to an invisible threat. The household's daily rhythm became punctuated by prayer, observation, and the constant expectation of new correspondence, creating an atmosphere in which devotion was inseparable from fear. The family's consultations extended beyond Father Aguilar. Isabel reached out to other clergy, nuns, and spiritual advisors, seeking interpretations and blessings. Some suggested that Isabella's spirit sought attention or release, while others warned of malevolent influence attempting to exploit grief and guilt. Rituals of protection were repeated with variations, from consecrated salt sprinkled along thresholds to prayers recited in the dead of night. Yet, with each attempt, the letters persisted, and subtle anomalies, the whispers, fleeting shadows, and inexplicable movements of household objects, continued unabated. Each failure was a reminder that faith, though deeply revered, could not fully contain or explain the phenomena. Tensions arose within the household as the family grappled with these spiritual interventions. Manuel, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of both rational and religious attempts, occasionally questioned whether their devotion was insufficient or misplaced. Isabel, fearful of moral failure and spiritual negligence, became increasingly zealous, her prayers intensifying in both frequency and fervor. The children, absorbing the heightened emotion, mirrored the anxiety and tension of their parents, deepening the family's overall sense of entrapment. The townhouse, once a place of refuge and comfort, now felt like a theater in which faith and fear performed an endless, intertwined dance. The letters, in their unyielding specificity, seemed almost to mock these religious efforts. One message referred explicitly to a prayer said that morning, noting that it had been insufficient, or mentioning a blessing attempted by Isabel, as if the unseen observer were not only aware of actions but capable of evaluating their efficacy. This subtle psychological pressure transformed ordinary ritual into a measure of success or failure, heightening guilt, fear, and emotional exhaustion. The family's reliance on faith became simultaneously their anchor and their torment, reinforcing the notion that the phenomenon could not be ignored and that ordinary devotion, however sincere, might never provide full protection or explanation. As weeks passed, the household began to develop a rhythm of spiritual vigilance, blending prayer, ritual, and careful observation with daily activities. Manuel maintained his catalogue of letters, noting spiritual interventions alongside the arrival of each envelope. Isabel continued her prayers, sometimes through tears, sometimes in quiet contemplation, always aware that each action was observed, acknowledged, and, in some ineffable way, tested. Even in moments of rest, the weight of expectation persisted, a reminder that faith could sustain but not fully shield, could illuminate but not entirely dispel, the pervasive tension that had come to define their lives. By the end of this period, the Del Valle household existed in a fragile equilibrium between fear, devotion, and uncertainty. Faith had become a framework through which they attempted to understand and survive the inexplicable, offering some measure of purpose and structure amidst chaos. Yet the phenomenon of the letters, the whispers, and the shadows remained undiminished, a persistent force that neither prayer nor ritual could fully constrain. Madrid continued its daily rhythm outside their doors, indifferent to the spiritual struggle within, leaving the family to navigate an increasingly tenuous existence where devotion was as much a response to terror as it was a refuge from it. As the letters continued to arrive, Manuel del Valle increasingly turned to reason and the tools of observation in an effort to make sense of the impossible. His days, once structured around clerical duties and household management, became consumed with cataloging each envelope, measuring the precise dimensions of the paper, analyzing the style of handwriting, and noting the minutest details of phrasing. Each letter was examined under candlelight, ink studied for its consistency, the folds of the paper compared for patterns that might reveal a human hand behind the phenomenon. Yet with every step taken toward rational understanding, the letters defied explanation, their content reflecting knowledge of events and conversations no ordinary observer could have witnessed. Manuel consulted scholars and experts in handwriting, postal delivery, and even the emerging field of forensic document analysis. Handwriting specialists confirmed the consistency and elegance of the script, but none could account for how such messages reached the household with accuracy that mirrored private moments. Postal clerks, though initially skeptical, were unable to identify any process by which the envelopes could have been delivered without detection. Each failed attempt at explanation compounded Manuel's frustration, forcing him to confront the limits of logic and human comprehension. Reason, once a reliable tool, now seemed insufficient against a force that operated outside conventional boundaries. Scientific inquiry became both a source of hope and of deepening despair. Manuel attempted to track the letters, noting arrival times, examining possible entry points, and even questioning neighbors discreetly to determine if anyone might have observed a courier or unusual activity. Yet the letters always appeared exactly where they had before, folded neatly, ink fresh, and sometimes referencing events that had only just occurred. The impossibility of their origin began to erode confidence in the material world itself. If letters could traverse space and time with such precision, what limits remained to the unseen forces encroaching upon the household? The family's psychological state further complicated the pursuit of rational explanation. Isabel, already strained by grief and fear, grew increasingly restless during Manuel's investigations, interpreting each failure as confirmation of forces beyond comprehension. She observed shadows lengthening unpredictably, small objects shifting imperceptibly, and the faint murmurs that had haunted their nights, all while Manuel meticulously measured and recorded each letter. The tension between observation and experience created an uneasy dynamic. Manuel sought certainty through reason, while Isabel increasingly relied on intuition, faith, and the visceral perception of the inexplicable. The household became a microcosm of the broader conflict between science and belief, between rationality and the unknown. Even the children became participants in this struggle. They watched their father's obsessive attention to detail, mimicking his actions with careful observation of the letters, while also responding instinctively to the whispering voices and shifting shadows. Their behavior reflected a dual awareness, one grounded in the tangible act of examining paper and ink, the other attuned to subtle phenomena that defied measurement. The house itself seemed to respond to this duality, amplifying uncertainty through irregular noises, sudden drafts, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Each attempt at rational explanation was shadowed by experiences that could not be measured, recorded, or logically reconciled. Neighbors began to take note of Manuel's increasingly meticulous behavior. Conversations on the street hinted at curiosity and fear, as people speculated on the family's strange rituals of measurement and observation. Some dismissed these actions as obsessive, a symptom of grief exacerbated by fear. Others whispered that the household had been marked by forces beyond understanding. Madrid, a city steeped in both superstition and modernity, provided fertile ground for these speculations. Within this environment, the Del Valle family's reliance on reason both distinguished them and isolated them, creating a tension between their desire for objective understanding and the subjective experiences that defied explanation. The letters themselves seemed to challenge reason directly. Some referenced actions that had only occurred within the household moments before the envelope arrived, as if the writer had anticipated behavior in real time. Others contained subtle predictions or warnings of minor accidents, often accurate in ways that were psychologically disorienting. Manuel attempted to replicate controlled experiments, leaving objects in particular arrangements, timing the arrival of envelopes, and noting changes in their content relative to household activity. Each attempt provided limited insight at best, and often confirmed the letter's unexplainable nature. The more he tried to understand, the more he was confronted with a reality that seemed to operate beyond the known laws of causality. This struggle for understanding began to take a toll on Manuel's mental state. Nights became restless, spent poring over observations and attempting to reconcile the letter's precision with possible human or natural mechanisms. The act of rational investigation, intended to restore control, instead highlighted the limits of comprehension. The more Manuel sought certainty, the more elusive it became. Isabel, observing his growing tension, oscillated between support and anxiety, offering comfort while simultaneously fearing that rational pursuit might provoke further, unseen consequences. The home had become an arena in which logic and intuition, faith and skepticism, coexisted in fragile balance, each reinforcing the other's fragility. Even as reason faltered, it offered a measure of structure. Manuel's meticulous records, cataloging the letter's arrivals, content, and timing, provided a framework within which the family could operate. Rituals of observation and measurement became as vital as prayer or caution, offering the semblance of agency in a reality dominated by the unexplained. Each entry in his ledger represented both an attempt at understanding and a recognition of limitation, a record that documented the impossible while striving to impose order upon it. By the end of this period, the Del Valle household existed in a tense equilibrium. Reason had not defeated the phenomenon, but it had created a methodology, a disciplined approach to survival and comprehension. The letters remained a persistent, inexplicable force, intruding upon the family's daily life with precision and intent. Shadows, whispers, and subtle disturbances continued unabated, challenging the limits of perception and comprehension. Madrid carried on indifferent beyond their doors, yet inside the townhouse, the interplay of logic, observation, and inexplicable experience had become a defining feature of existence. Reason, though under siege, remained both a tool and a tether, guiding the family's responses even as it exposed the vastness of what they could not understand. As the weeks turned into months, the Del Valle household began to experience a gradual, almost imperceptible descent into isolation and silence. The relentless arrival of letters, the whispers that seemed to echo from empty corners, and the shadows that flickered unnaturally along walls had transformed daily life into a series of tense rituals. Meals were eaten quietly, conversations measured and cautious, every movement observed for the possibility of provoking another message or unsettling phenomenon. The townhouse, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a stage for constant vigilance, where each family member moved as though under the scrutiny of invisible eyes. The family's interactions with the outside world diminished. Manuel's trips to the municipal office grew infrequent. When he did leave, he walked with a nervous vigilance, his attention drawn repeatedly to the envelopes he might find awaiting him at home. Isabel avoided street gatherings, leaving neighbors to speculate about her frailty, her preoccupation, and the weight of grief that seemed to cling visibly to her. Children once accustomed to play and exploration retreated into quiet corners, their laughter replaced by watchful observation of the smallest disturbances in the house. Madrid streets continued their ordinary rhythm, oblivious to the quiet suffocation occurring behind the townhouse doors, yet the family's retreat from public life intensified their sense of being trapped within their own reality. The letters, now a constant presence, appeared with an almost deliberate timing. Each envelope seemed to arrive in alignment with moments of tension or domestic activity, reinforcing the impression that they were not merely messages but instruments of control. One morning, a letter described in chilling detail the exact position of objects in the parlor the night before. Another, arriving at twilight, referenced a conversation held in whispers by Isabel and Manuel. These precise observations, impossible to account for through ordinary means, created a suffocating sense that the family's privacy had been obliterated, leaving them perpetually exposed to an unseen intelligence. As the family adapted to this intrusive rhythm, psychological strain deepened. Isabel, already haunted by grief and anxiety, developed compulsive behaviors, checking and rechecking locks, inspecting each corner for unnoticed anomalies, and constantly scanning the shadows for movement. Manuel's obsession with cataloging letters and documenting occurrences escalated, his ledger becoming a meticulous record of the impossible, a desperate attempt to impose structure on an uncontrollable reality. The children, sensing the adults' tension, mirrored their behaviors in miniature, moving cautiously, observing quietly, and avoiding spaces that felt unsafe or strange. Within the townhouse, ordinary life had been replaced by a choreography of vigilance, ritual, and fear. External visits and social interactions became rare, and when they occurred, they were fraught with unease. Friends and relatives who entered the home often left with a subtle but unmistakable tension, unable to reconcile the ordinary domestic environment with the undercurrent of dread. Conversations about the letters were cautious and incomplete, as though even speaking of the phenomenon might provoke further manifestations. The family's isolation was not simply physical but psychological, reinforced by the perception that no outside intervention could provide relief or understanding. Madrid, vibrant and bustling beyond their walls, contrasted sharply with the suffocating stillness of the townhouse, highlighting the growing gulf between the world outside and the private reality within. Sleep, once a refuge, became another site of anxiety. The whispers, shadows, and the psychological weight of anticipation infiltrated the night, creating a state in which rest was tentative and fragmented. Dreams were vivid and unsettling, often incorporating the letters themselves, their contents transforming into voices or shifting imagery. Isabel frequently awoke in the early hours, convinced she had heard her daughter's voice calling from a distant room. Manuel, too, found his mind restless, replaying events of the day, cataloging letters mentally, and attempting to anticipate the timing of future arrivals. The household's descent into silence was paralleled by a descent into a liminal space where waking and dreaming, reality and imagination, merged in a constant tension. The phenomenon of shadows intensified during this period. Candlelight, gas lamps, and sunlight cast forms that seemed to move with intent, elongating, shrinking, or shifting independently of the household's activity. Objects appeared subtly displaced, as though brushed by unseen hands, reinforcing the impression that the home was no longer under the sole dominion of the living. These small, almost imperceptible anomalies accumulated over time, eroding confidence in perception and creating an environment in which silence was both a coping mechanism and a strategy for avoiding provocation. Every sound, movement, and flicker of light carried potential significance, heightening vigilance and amplifying anxiety. The psychological toll of prolonged exposure to these anomalies became evident in the family's interactions. Isabel, once warm and engaging, became withdrawn, speaking only when necessary and often muttering prayers under her breath. Manuel's demeanor, while methodical and precise, revealed growing tension and fatigue, his observations tinged with both fascination and desperation. The children's reticence mirrored that of their parents, their playfulness replaced by quiet observation and cautious movement. The home, once a site of familial intimacy, had transformed into a landscape dominated by anticipation, fear, and the persistent weight of unexplained presence. By the end of this period, the Del Valle household existed in a state of fragile equilibrium, defined by routine, vigilance, and the persistent intrusion of letters, shadows, and whispers. Silence had become both a necessity and a burden, a way to navigate an environment where ordinary behavior seemed to invite observation or manipulation. The city outside remained unaware, continuing in its rhythm, indifferent to the psychological siege occurring within the townhouse. Within those walls, however, the family had adapted to a world where every sound, movement, and thought was shadowed by anticipation, and where descent into silence was both a survival strategy and an inevitable consequence of the unrelenting, inexplicable forces that had invaded their lives. By the time the letters had persisted for several months, the Del Valle household was on the edge of collapse. The delicate equilibrium they had maintained, between vigilance, faith, and reason, was beginning to falter under the relentless pressure of unexplainable phenomena. Each day brought new challenges, subtle yet cumulative, eroding both emotional resilience and mental clarity. The family's routines, once meticulously observed, now functioned less as stabilizing rituals and more as desperate attempts to assert control over a reality that had become unpredictable, invasive, and psychologically suffocating. The letters, having evolved from mere warnings to detailed chronicles of the family's daily life, seemed to anticipate behavior, referencing minor accidents, hushed conversations, and even fleeting thoughts that no outsider could possibly have known. Isabel, already burdened with grief for her deceased daughter, began to interpret each note as a personal indictment, a reflection of moral or spiritual failings that required constant attention and penitence. Manuel, while grounded in reason, found the predictive nature of the letters increasingly difficult to reconcile with logic, leading to frustration, obsessive cataloging, and intermittent bouts of despair. The children, sensitive to the emotional tension permeating the household, mirrored these anxieties, withdrawing further into quiet observation and hesitant, cautious behavior. The physical environment of the townhouse contributed to the psychological strain. Shadows seemed to deepen and shift in unnatural ways, flickering across walls and floors with a subtle intelligence, as if responding to the family's movements. Footsteps, creaks, and rustling sounds became part of the household's daily soundtrack, often coinciding with the arrival of a new letter or the anticipation of one. Doors and windows, though securely fastened, occasionally appeared slightly ajar, while small objects, books, utensils, or personal items, were discovered out of place. Each anomaly, though minor in isolation, compounded over time, reinforcing the sense that the home had been infiltrated by an unseen force that observed, judged, and manipulated the family at every turn. Neighbors continued to notice changes as well, though interactions were brief and cautious. Passers-by observed Isabel and Manuel moving through the house with heightened vigilance, their eyes scanning corridors and windows, often speaking in hushed tones to one another. Children in the neighborhood, sensing the tension, avoided playing near the townhouse, while adults whispered theories about curses, spirits, or familial madness. Madrid, with its mixture of superstition and modern rationality, provided fertile ground for speculation, yet no intervention arose from the outside. The household's isolation deepened, creating a closed system in which fear, expectation, and obsession interacted without relief or escape. Attempts to interpret or counter the letters intensified, yet proved insufficient. Manuel continued his methodical documentation, noting not only the letters' arrival times and content but also their correlations with household activity, environmental changes, and emotional reactions. Isabel devoted herself to increasingly elaborate spiritual practices, reciting prayers, lighting candles, and performing protective rituals throughout the house. Yet each intervention, whether grounded in reason or faith, failed to diminish the letter's influence or the accompanying phenomena. The family became trapped in a cycle of anticipation, observation, and response, unable to break free from the persistent intrusion of the unknown. The psychological impact became more pronounced as the letter's content grew. Increasingly personalized and prescriptive. One note instructed Isabel to perform a particular task at a specific hour, referencing her previous hesitation and framing compliance as a moral imperative. Another described a minor accident that had occurred earlier that day, presenting it as evidence of negligence. Each message blurred the boundaries between suggestion, observation, and judgment, forcing the family to navigate not only the letter's literal content but also their psychological implications. The home became a space where ordinary decision-making was overshadowed by anticipation, guilt, and the subtle threat of unseen oversight. Interactions among family members also shifted under this sustained pressure. Isabel's vigilance often clashed with Manuel's methodical inquiry, creating tension and moments of conflict. Discussions of the letters or household occurrences were laden with anxiety, the act of speaking itself fraught with the risk of provoking further scrutiny. The children, acutely attuned to the adults' emotional states, developed heightened sensitivity to tone, gesture, and the smallest shifts in behavior. Within this dynamic, fear, obedience, and caution became the primary modes of interaction, supplanting warmth, spontaneity, and ordinary domestic life. External interventions, though occasionally sought, provided limited relief. Clergy offered prayers and blessings, yet even these were accompanied by the acknowledgement that the phenomenon might operate beyond human understanding. Scholars and experts, when consulted, could confirm only the authenticity and consistency of the handwriting, unable to account for its knowledge of private events or precise timing. Postal authorities confirmed that no ordinary delivery mechanism could account for the letter's arrival. Each consultation, while momentarily reassuring, ultimately reinforced the limits of rational and institutional solutions, emphasizing the inescapable and inexplicable nature of the household's plight. The cumulative effect of months under this sustained psychological strain was a gradual unraveling. Sleep remained fitful, often disturbed by dreams in which the letters spoke or moved. Shadows and whispers persisted, subtly intensifying the family's anxiety. The children, already withdrawn, became increasingly hesitant to move through certain areas of the house alone. Isabel's spiritual practices, once comforting, became exercises in obsession and fear. Manuel's cataloging and observation, initially a source of control, now highlighted the impossibility of comprehension. In this environment, ordinary life, routine, and domestic stability disintegrated, leaving the family suspended in a liminal space between anticipation, dread, and exhaustion. Despite the pervasive strain, the Del Valle family maintained a fragile semblance of order. Meals continued, chores were performed, and external obligations were met, though all activities were overshadowed by fear and the weight of expectation. The letters, ever present and unrelenting, structured the household's existence, dictating rhythms, provoking vigilance, and shaping behavior. Madrid outside carried on unaware, but within the townhouse, the family's psychological unraveling was profound, a testament to the power of the inexplicable to disrupt, dominate, and redefine the ordinary. By the end of this period, it was clear that the Del Valle household had crossed a threshold. The intrusion of the letters, whispers, and shadows had transformed both the physical space and the mental landscape of the family. The interplay of fear, anticipation, and the impossible had eroded ordinary life, leaving a fragile, haunted existence in which survival depended on vigilance, obedience, and the tenuous hope that comprehension, or relief, might one day be possible. The unraveling had not yet reached its absolute conclusion, but the trajectory was undeniable. The household, once grounded in routine and stability, had become a landscape dominated by anticipation, dread, and the persistent, unyielding presence of the impossible. As the relentless months wore on, the Del Valle household began to teeter on the edge of collapse. The daily rituals, prayers, cataloging, and vigilant observation that had once structured their lives were now mere scaffolding for a fragile and precarious existence. The letters, whispers, and shadows had become omnipresent forces, shaping every movement, thought, and emotion within the home. What had begun as confusion and fear had evolved into a pervasive sense of inevitability, that the family was approaching a point from which there could be no return, a vanishing point where the boundaries of reality, perception, and sanity blurred irreversibly. Manuel's meticulous record-keeping had reached an obsessive intensity. Every letter, every anomaly, every subtle sound was documented with near-scientific precision, yet the act of cataloging did little to alleviate the sense of helplessness. The letters themselves seemed almost to respond to his efforts, appearing with uncanny timing or containing commentary that reflected his own meticulous behavior. Isabel, attuned to the unseen presence and the moral weight of the correspondence, intensified her spiritual practices. She spent hours kneeling before the altar, repeating prayers with fervent devotion, yet each new message challenged her sense of faith, suggesting that even piety could not guarantee protection. The children, now increasingly withdrawn, mirrored the household's escalating tension. Their playfulness, curiosity, and spontaneity had been replaced by caution, silence, and observation. They moved through the house as though navigating a minefield, sensitive to the whispers, shadows, and minor disturbances that had become daily occurrences. Even minor deviations from expected behavior were noted and sometimes referenced in the letters, reinforcing the family's sense that their private thoughts and actions were under constant surveillance. Madrid, vibrant and bustling beyond the townhouse walls, contrasted sharply with the oppressive, meticulous attention demanded within the home. The letters grew increasingly complex in their psychological effect. Some contained direct references to past events, others anticipated actions yet to occur, and still others blurred the line between observation and manipulation. One note described a minor argument that had taken place between Isabel and Manuel in hushed tones that evening, detailing not only the words spoken but the emotional intensity of the exchange. Another referenced a minor accident in the household and framed it as an ominous warning of greater consequences. Each message, precise and intimate, reinforced the impossibility of ordinary explanation, leaving the family in a constant state of tension and anticipation. The auditory phenomena intensified as well. The whispers that had once been indistinct grew more insistent, sometimes coalescing into phrases that echoed the content of the letters. Shadows shifted and elongated with a subtle, deliberate intelligence, forming shapes that suggested presence without revealing source. Even ordinary objects appeared to move with intention, a chair slightly displaced, a book found open to a particular page, a window left ajar despite careful attention. The cumulative effect was a heightened vigilance bordering on paranoia, as each family member adjusted behavior to anticipate the next intrusion, the next message, the next whispered warning. Attempts to seek external explanation or assistance remained largely futile. Clergy provided prayers, blessings, and guidance, yet their interventions could not prevent the arrival of new letters or the continuation of the subtle disturbances. Scholars and experts in handwriting and delivery systems offered partial insight but were unable to account for the letters' content, timing, or inexplicable accuracy. Postal officials confirmed that no human method could explain the envelope's arrival with such consistency and secrecy. Each failed attempt at rational or institutional intervention reinforced the sense of inevitability, leaving the household increasingly dependent on vigilance, ritual, and internal frameworks of order. Isolation became nearly absolute. Visits from neighbors, friends, and extended family were increasingly rare, and when they occurred, they were brief and uneasy. The townhouse, already a confined and tense environment, had become a self-contained world where the letters dictated the rhythm of life, and where the family's behavior was constrained by anticipation, fear, and exhaustion. Outside interactions were minimized, both to protect the family from exposure and because the outside world could not comprehend the extraordinary circumstances that had overtaken the household. The psychological and emotional strain reached a point where even ordinary moments were fraught with tension. Meals, once a time for shared domestic comfort, became exercises in silence and careful attention. Movement through rooms was measured and deliberate, designed to avoid provoking observation or disturbance. Sleep was restless, punctuated by dreams in which the letters spoke, moved, or threatened consequences. The children, observing their parents' vigilance, mirrored these behaviors in miniature, further reinforcing the household state of constant anxiety and anticipation. As the letters' influence intensified, the Del Valle family began to feel the edges of reality fraying. Their home, once a sanctuary, had become a domain dominated by unseen forces, where perception, anticipation, and ritual intertwined to define existence. Each day approached a threshold. One more message, one more whispered phrase, one more subtle anomaly could push the household further into psychological collapse. The sense of a vanishing point, a boundary beyond which ordinary life, reason, and emotional stability could no longer persist, loomed ever nearer, a specter toward which every day moved inexorably. By the end of this period, the Del Valle household existed in a suspended state between reality and the unimaginable. The letters, shadows, and whispers had transformed their home into a landscape of constant tension, observation, and fear. Madrid beyond the townhouse continued an indifferent routine, but inside, the family teetered at the brink, their lives dictated by forces beyond comprehension. Each movement, each thought, each ritual reinforced the presence of the impossible, and the vanishing point, the moment at which ordinary existence might dissolve entirely, hung like a silent, inevitable horizon, shaping every aspect of the household's existence with unrelenting intensity.